The dominant voices of our time are often broken, flawed, destructive. Humans seem to be drawn like moths to the rhetoric of the arrogant, the scoundrel, the unjust. But if we let our feet travel a different path, a more ancient path, we find an unusual character with a different sound. A man called Jeremiah, a prophet, an artist, a performer even, a storyteller rooted in street theater, exciting symbols, powerful images. So what makes this man any different? Why should we listen to him? Because Jeremiah was good.
This weekend, we're finishing off Jeremiah. Jeremiah, one of the things that I've loved about what he's been doing, and I find myself kind of wondering about this, like great artists, I think Jeremiah does best when he speaks about really obvious stuff. Have you ever noticed that about great artists? That it's not that they sort of take something really obscure and say, hey, have you ever noticed this really obscure thing before? But really good art kind of points you towards the everyday and makes you look at the everyday in ways that you'd never seen it before. Really good artists, you find yourself looking at the work going, why did I never see that? Because it's so obvious. And I think great prophets do the same. Jeremiah had this immense imagination, but some of his most profound moments kind of happen in everyday stuff. In fact, perhaps the text that we're jumping to this morning is the most famous text from Jeremiah. Oftentimes, when you actually ask people, do you know any of the stories of Jeremiah? This is the one that we seem to be aware of. In Jeremiah chapter 18, Jeremiah takes a boring, everyday image and draws us to God with it. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. Now, when you imagine this story, there's a tendency to imagine it as a 21st century person. So you think to yourself, wow, imagine like you're in the Mediterranean somewhere on your vacation, you're on this little tiny street, and at the corner, at the end of this little tiny street, there's a pottery house. And in this really quaint little pottery house, there's an old man, and he's just shaping these beautiful, beautiful pieces of pottery that just look stunning. And you immediately look at it and think, I'm gonna take one of them home for my mom. And then you come to this moment in Jeremiah and you think, yes, I'm with you, Jeremiah. But Jeremiah lived a couple of thousand or so years ago. And in Jeremiah's day, pottery was kind of held with the same sort of regard that you hold to a Safeway bag. Which I realize now that they're charging for them, maybe you do hold them in a little more. Like, that cupboard underneath my sink is now worth about $1,000. And if I could sell those on the black market or Kijiji or something like that. But you look at a Safeway bag, you don't look at it with any sort of great degree of pride. You don't think, wow, I really must take this to my mom. It's just an everyday normal item. In Jeremiah's world, pot makers were ubiquitous. They're everywhere you went, you'd bump into pot makers because people pretty much used them for anything. Pots were just functional things to carry things in. Pots could be used as toilets, and pots could be used as water containers. And if you were rich, you didn't have to use them both the same thing. And we find in archaeological sites across the ancient world that sometimes when pots got broken, they just turned the pieces of them into things to write on. So you find short stories sometimes scrawled on a pot, sometimes even just shopping lists written on the side of pots. Pots weren't fancy things. They were everyday things. And as a result, pottery makers, it's Canada, right? You gotta be careful. pottery makers weren't interesting people. Maybe pot makers were, I don't know, but pottery makers were not interesting people. You meet a pottery maker at like a party, like you're not like, oh my goodness, that's like I love going to parties and meeting people with interesting jobs. And I kind of have it as a sort of sense of pride that I'm pretty much good at talking to anybody about their job because I love learning about what jobs do. So I meet someone and they're like, oh, I analyze traffic flow patterns. And I'm like, tell me about that. But if you were in the ancient world and you met a pottery maker, you're like, oh my goodness, where's this conversation going to go? Because this is just not interesting. And yet this boring job with a kind of, producing something that's not that interesting. Like, sure, we see pots now that they can be beautiful, but that's not why they were really making them generally in those days. A boring job, a boring product. Jeremiah takes as a metaphor for the paradox of our lives. He takes it and he draws us into it. And we have this lump of clay. In the middle of this story, there appears to be, we're kind of drawn to this lump of clay. And it's fascinating if you think about it. Maybe you've seen somebody make something with clay. And you've seen them form it and shape it. And if it's done well, it has function and utility. Or maybe the only clay thing you've got is that thing your son brought home in grade 3. And you're not sure if it's supposed to be, an ashtray or a idol to a foreign god. It's a strange lump of clay that they did in some sort of art class in school, but it's precious, so you stick it on your window. But the clay has the potential to be formed into something. The clay has value. It has purpose. Because it's going to produce something that hopefully would have utility. It's going to produce something that has function. And sometimes it might even produce something that has beauty. And why is this? Well, because the clay is moldable, because the clay can be formed, because the clay is adaptable. In fact, I was just reading this week that one of the key attributes that employers are increasingly looking for amongst their workforce is adaptability. Can you change? Can you adjust? Can you work within the environment that you need to be in? Career paths have changed over the last several generations, where it used to be that you could pick your career path and stick to it. But now what we're being told is if you want to really work well in your workplace, you need to be able to roll and move and adjust with the way that the world is rolling and moving and adjusting. It's never moved this fast before in history, we say. And how do we respond to that? Well, we as a people generally say, yes, we can keep up with this. We can adjust like pro skiers coming down a tough trail. We can navigate our way around life. Why? Because we're in charge of our own lives. One of the real developments of our contemporary society has been this notion that we're in charge of our own lives. We've kind of buffered our lives with a kind of good personal zone, and within this, we navigate life the way that we would like it to be navigated. We do the things that we want to do. We have autonomy, we say. I'm the captain of my own ship. I get to do what I want. And yet, that's quite interesting at this point in history. Because whereas we find ourselves at a point in history where perhaps the expectations of your community, or perhaps the expectations of your family, or the expectations of your religion don't really influence the decisions that you make with your life, we're actually quite new in that sort of way of thinking. You only need to go back a couple of generations, or just go a few thousand miles in a different direction in the world, and you'll find societies where actually what my community think, what my parents think, what my God thinks are hugely influential factors in what I do with my life and how I work my life out. You can find places in the world today where the suggestion that you would choose a career that wasn't in line with the ones that your parents wanted would be shocking. People would say, no, you can't do that. In fact, you maybe go a few generations ago, you would find people that, well, I'll just do with my life what my parents did with their life because that's what our family does. And here we are in our present saying, no, we get to choose. We get to decide what we do with ourselves. And therefore, we adapt and adjust our own lives to suit what we think we need and what we think we want to do with it. Perhaps like the clay in Jeremiah's image, we provide the constraints and we provide the freedoms. So we are the shapers. We are the designers of our own realities. But Jeremiah keeps watching this scene And something happens. The clay is spoiled. The clay isn't quite right. The story becomes all of our stories. That somewhere along this story, something goes wrong. The Bible doesn't tell us what goes wrong. Was it that the clay was too sloppy? Or was it that the clay was too dry? Or were there some foreign contaminants in the clay that were making it not work out? It's hard to tell. Was it overdone, underdone? The Bible doesn't tell us, and maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter why the clay got faulty. Maybe it doesn't matter why the clay got spoiled, because actually we're familiar with this story, that things set out well, and then they kind of start falling apart on us. If I was just to jump into the crowd right now and just pick someone at random and say, tell me about, I'm not going to do this, don't worry. Tell me about your life. How many people do you think in a room like this would say, well, it started exactly as I hoped it would and continued exactly as I planned until where I am right now, where everything's going well? What do you reckon the chances of that being any of our stories? In truth, we all recognize, just like Jeremiah does, that the clay getting spoiled isn't a surprise. It's not like a great shock in the story, like, oh, it didn't go quite right for you. We're so used to things not going right for one another that we have like a stock of socially acceptable responses to these sort of things. You meet your friend at work one day. How are you doing, you say? They say, I had a rough weekend. I just broke up with my boyfriend. So you go to your pocket, you take out the card, you shuffle through it, you say, there are plenty more fish in the sea. I wonder whoever came up with that saying. We should find that person, drag them out into the street and beat them to death or something like that. But we have a saying for it. Like it's so normal that relationships go badly that we have they're useless sayings, but we have sayings, right? If you lose your job, if something goes wrong with your house, there are all sorts of disasters that are so common to us that they hardly even register with us. We know how to respond in those disasters because somewhere along the line we learned that life rarely goes A to B. Instead, something happens and it gets spoiled. So Jeremiah is not surprised to see this. You're not surprised to see this. The question that Jeremiah seems to want to ask us is, do you know why? You know why it seems to always go like this? Now for Jeremiah, this is quite clear. In fact, at some level, this is Jeremiah's whole story. This is what the whole book of Jeremiah is about. I figured after 6 weeks, the final week, we should probably get round to what's actually going on in this scary text. The whole text seems to work towards the same thing. It constantly, in different ways, brings us back to this one thought, that the people that Jeremiah is surrounded by, they are absolutely convinced of their own autonomy. We can do what we want to do. We know best as to how to work our lives. We will adapt to the situation that we find ourselves in, and we'll make the best of it. But Jeremiah's message is constantly saying the same thing back to them. In your attempt to adapt, in your attempt to apply your own autonomy to your life and your country, what you've actually done is you've just assimilated to everybody else. You've just become like everyone else. While you're worried about Egyptians on one side, you've become like the Babylonians on the other. While you're worried about Assyrians, you've become like the Egyptians. And while you're worried about Babylonians, you've become like someone else. What happens is we think we're autonomous. We think we're doing our own thing. We think of ourselves as pioneers. Look at me, cutting my path, making a great job of my life. But what Jeremiah is speaking to is actually when we step away from trying to figure out life as it was designed by God, what happens is we end up not doing anything that original. In fact, we just kind of end up in the same mess that everybody else ends up in. What happens to most humans, and in Jeremiah's case, he's more confident than I am, what happens to all humans is when we step away from the design of our Creator, we find the pot slowly starts to fall apart. The text continues in verse 5 of chapter 18 that Jeremiah, after seeing this scene, hears from God. God's message came to me. What does God say? Can't I just do as this potter does? Watch this potter. In the same way that this potter works his clay, I work on you. See, the image Jeremiah sees at the potter's house isn't an image of me trying to shape my life. Actually, the image that Jeremiah sees is an image of God. And this is the image at the heart of the whole book of Jeremiah. See, the people want to blow themselves up doing their own thing. That's the story of Israel. They're just doing their own thing, and it's not going well for them, but they point blank refuse to pay any attention to this. So Jeremiah appears and he says, hey, you're blowing your life up. Let me show you a better way to be. Let me show you a way that will actually bring peace and wholeness to you. But if you're going to know, let's just try this again, because I don't think we've quite exhausted the possibilities over here. And so Jeremiah comes back time and again to these people to call them back to a better way of life, and they ignore him. So finally, we switch to imagery. That Jeremiah says, maybe if I can show them an image, maybe God seems to say, if you can just present to these people something they can relate to, this will help them understand. We're not talking about this morning, but 2 chapters later, as Jeremiah really unpacks this imagery of the pottery and the pots, a priest comes down and beats him up for it. So it really goes well for him. Apparently, in Jeremiah's time, people didn't like being told they were wrong. In Jeremiah's time. See, because the prophetic image gets deep into our personal space. We've built this buffer around our lives. We say, I know where I live, and I'm a captain of this bit of my life. And Jeremiah presents them this image of God being the shaper, of God being the controller, of God being the one with the plan. And therefore, somewhat offensively, that means I'm the clay. Like I'm just the lump of mush that's spinning around on a wheel with no form, with no sense of identity. All I am is the thing that's not behaving in the story. I got zero power. I got very, very little autonomy in this and almost no choice. And this seems to be offensive to me. Like I actually, as a modern person, I read this, I go, I'm not really happy with this. I'm not happy with the idea of me just being the lump of clay in the middle of this story. I like the idea of thinking of the clay when I get to be the potter. But what if God's the potter? See, because this is what's at the heart of this story. Jeremiah is not trying to tell them in this story about them. He's trying to tell them about God. So what does Jeremiah want us to see about God? What does he see in this potter story that actually he sees throughout the whole story? See, the fascinating thing for Jeremiah is he wants to give us a clear image of God. He wants to show us a picture of God that actually we might sometimes struggle with. Because I think what happens is within our own attempt to be autonomous, we'll shape our own lives. What we often try and do is shape our own gods as well. And Jeremiah's talked to us about that elsewhere. We want to shape the gods that we want. So you meet some people and they're very, very serious and they're quite intense. And you notice how often their view of God is very serious and intense. I talk to Christians sometimes and they tell me about God and it terrifies me. Like, honestly, their view of God is scary. How they sleep at night is just beyond me. But they say, oh, this is the God that sent Jesus. I'm like, this God sounds like a maniac and terrifying. And I don't want to turn to him. I don't want to trust him. And then other people tell me about their God. And he kind of sounds like some sort of cotton candy fluff, that I'm like, well, it's lovely that your God loves you, but I'd hate to be in a fight with him on my side because, I'd blow away. Have you ever heard that? You talk to people and they tell you about God and you think, where's the substance to this God? So where do we go with that? And we so often feel that we have to choose one or the other. Either you've got this kind of abhorrent kind of view of God that seems to be propagated by really angry people on Twitter, or you have this other view of God who just seems so meh, just empty. But the Bible gives us a different picture of God. It gives us this picture of God at a potter's wheel. This is the God that the Bible wants to talk to us about. His primary characteristics are a long-suffering refusal to give up on us. See, because notice the potter, he has this clay, and the clay starts to spoil, and this God doesn't just scrap it and start again. This God doesn't just give up and say, this isn't working out, let me try someone else, but rather this God repairs, this God returns, this God reforms, this God renews, this God resurrects. One of those profound things we see about this God in the story of Jeremiah is that if this God lived in your street, he wouldn't have a trash cart. He would just have a recycle bin. This God only recycles. He doesn't trash. He doesn't give up. He doesn't throw away. He doesn't lose hope. For me, this is important because Jeremiah's view of God is actually the biblical view of God. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13, we get this beautiful little refrain that talks about even in our most faithless moments, what do we say about God? He remains faithful, Paul says to Timothy, for he cannot deny himself. See, God is faithful. That means trustworthy. That means committed. That means he doesn't give up. He has fidelity. He commits to what he said he will commit to. And so often, this is not the God that we would imagine. I talk to some people about God, and I get this impression of a God with a short temper and a long memory. Have you ever encountered that? That it seems like this God's very angry at stuff I did a very long time ago. And therefore, I find this God slightly terrifying. Or I find myself thinking about a God who has nothing really serious to offer me. But the biblical God offers you relentless faithfulness, an inability to give up on you, relentless in reshaping, relentless in reforming, renewing, and resurrecting. And whether it's shown to us an image of a potter sinking his hands into yet another failing pot, or whether it's Jeremiah, buying a field in occupied territory to remind us that God doesn't give up on us and will take us home there one day, or whether it's Jesus' blood poured out into our dirt, whatever image it is you find of God in the Bible, you see a God who's relentlessly committed and relentlessly invested. So what does the potter do when the clay pot spoils? He just throws it against the wall, has one of those, which I would call a kind of David Harvey DIY meltdowns. I assess the job. I assessed at $30 at Best Buy. I realize even now how little DIY I do because I arrive at Best Buy and realize it's Home Depot that I'm supposed to be at. And you mean Apple don't make hammers? And I come home with my $30 worth of gear, and I always discover when I try to do DIY that I'm always dealing with really bad houses, bad tools, and bad kind of, products. It's never me, but it's always this sort of stuff. And I invariably make a bigger mess than I started with. And there's always a point in many of my experiences where I have to just scrap it and start again. But God in this story, he doesn't just pick up this clay pot and throw it out the window. He doesn't throw it on the floor. He doesn't say this clay's ruined, therefore I'm going to give up on it. A slightly more kind of word-for-word translation of Jeremiah chapter 18 and verse 4, this is clunky to read and remember, but it kind of speaks to some of the Hebrew verbiage that's going on here. When the vessel which he was making from clay was ruined in his hands, what does he do? He turned it to make it again into another vessel as it seemed best in his eyes to make it. He turned it to make it again into another vessel. He turned it to make it again. My entire preaching career rests on this here moment. Anybody want to guess at the Hebrew that's floating beneath that sentence? Oh goodness, I can keep preaching. If you weren't here last week, you're like, why did they all just tell him to shush? You can listen to the podcast and make sense of that. He shoved it, the text says. Which in one sense you may want to just translate as he turned it, but we were here last week and we remember that for Jeremiah, this logic of shuv is a really deep word because it's the word that we translate return. It's also the word that we translate repent. It's also this notion and idea of being brought back home. So the potter is making a pot and he's forming it and shaping it and he's bringing it to a particular moment and something goes wrong. Maybe it's the consistency, maybe it's too sloppy, maybe it's too dry, maybe some contaminant got there and ruined it. And whereas it would make sense to just throw that away and start again, not this potter. This potter wants this pot to achieve what it's supposed to. He wants this pot to be what he imagined it to. Because notice, he has an idea in his eyes of what is best for this lump of clay. So he repents it, or he reforms it, or he returns it, or he brings it back down to its basics. And he starts to reform it into a new image. something that makes sense to him, something that he sees. Which again, actually starts to lean into our autonomy. It's not that God just brings us home. It's not that God just allows us to repent. It's not that God just says, this is where you belong. It's that when we come back home, he has something in mind for us. You're not meant to just be a lump of clay, but actually you're supposed to be something other than that. And so the potter goes back to work. But the key thing is the authority for that comes from him. God doesn't bring this pot back and go, well, let's see what you want to be. But no, he reforms it because he has a better idea of what this pot is going to look like. This is the great paradox of the book of Jeremiah. It's also the paradox of following Jesus. And if you read Paul, it's there in his letters as well. That the paradox of following God as a human is you have to learn submission. You have to learn that he seems to know best, that he's the potter, that you're the clay, and that he has an idea of what seems best to do with our lives. This brave countercultural message of Jeremiah, of the Bible, and even a brave countercultural message of the church is that we are clay and God is the potter. Notice Jesus, when he calls his disciples, he doesn't say, come follow me and let's see what you'd like to do with your life. He doesn't say, come follow me and I can give you a great hope for the future while you carry on in the same way right now. He actually says to these disciples, come follow me and I will make you fishers of people. That matters because he's talking to fishers of fish. And he says to these fishers of fish, stop doing that and start doing this. Even in the message of Jesus, we see the potter's hand shaping and forming again. Jesus is going to do the making. He's going to do the forming. God has shooved us. He has returned us. He has brought us home for a purpose. This potter thinks he knows what he can do with you. Michael Gorman, writing about St. Paul's letters, says that we see the same thing happening in Paul. That those who respond in trust or faith to Christ are moved into Christ, into the sphere of his life. Simultaneously, those who move into Christ find that Christ has moved into them, so to speak. You see, again, you see Paul messing with this idea of autonomy. Jeremiah says there's a potter and he's shaping you. Jesus says, follow me because I'm going to make you into something. And Paul seems to be saying to us, if we follow Christ, that means Christ is the shaper, former. He's the sphere in which we live. Perhaps it's why in Romans 12, Paul says, present yourself daily as a living sacrifice. And why it maybe needs to be sort of said like this is, in one sense, I think we sometimes as Christians say, it's kind of complex following Jesus. It's hard to make sense of what it is that we're supposed to do. And I'm becoming increasingly suspicious in my own life when I actually suggest it's complex following Jesus. What I really mean is, actually, it's quite simple, but it's going to be difficult, and I prefer not to do it. So if I say it's complex, it kind of lets me off the hook just a little tiny bit. But Paul seems to want to speak to something that Jesus and Jeremiah want to speak to, is that it's not that it's complex following Jesus, it's just hard. Sometimes it's just difficult. Because when I follow Jesus, if I'm submitting myself to him being the potter, to switch back to Jeremiah's metaphor, what I'm saying is that he gets to decide what happens with me, that he gets to decide what I should look like. The cross drops a sort of template over my life and says, this is what it looks like to be Christ-shaped. And the problem is, when you drop that template over, that means that there's some bits of my life might look Christ-shaped, but there's other bits of my life won't look Christ-shaped. And now it's all going to hang on how much of my own autonomy I want to have, and also how well I cope with being told that I'm wrong. And most of us get a little snowflakey when we're told that we're wrong. We like to accuse everybody else of being a little like that. It's amazing how easy it is to spot how much other people struggle with being wrong. Have you noticed this? What's really hard is when I have to face up to the possibility that I might be wrong, that there might be something of me that God wants to sort of knock off. There might be something of me that God wants to reshape. And I'm kind of okay with reshaping myself as long as I'm in control of the reshaping. But what Paul speaks of and Jesus speaks of and Jeremiah speaks of is we come before God and he gets to do the reshaping of our lives. Because the gospel is about a God who loves you and rescues you and is relentlessly committed to you, and is so relentlessly committed to you, he doesn't want to just leave you as a lump of clay that has some problems, but instead he wants to shape you into something better. The gospel is brave enough to challenge our own autonomy. The gospel is interested in what you do with your money, with your time, with the way you treat people, the way you think about people, who you sleep with, what you watch, what you do on the internet. All of these things are par for the gospel to get involved in. Why? Because God's trying to shape us into something that's beautiful, something that's useful, something that has function. But the reason we struggle with this perhaps is because at the root of all of this is this thing the Bible calls sin. And this thing the Bible calls sin kind of gets in and starts to break us down, spoils this clay, perhaps, as Jeremiah would say. And you can go to as many courses, take as much therapy, get a coach, do whatever you like. You're never going to actually solve that problem of sin. What Jeremiah seems to want to tell the people to do, what Jesus wants to tell us, what Paul and all of the Scripture wants to tell us, is you don't need somebody to help you gain autonomy over your sin. You need somebody to kill it. We gathered around tables just a moment ago because we were reminding ourselves that somebody did that. But we got to submit. We got to hand over the plans. We got to give up the control to the potter who died on a cross. So Jeremiah's message comes to us 2,600 years later and gives us a relentless God sat at a wheel and says, you're the clay. David, that's you. You're a lump of clay and you're kind of messy. And you have a tendency to get off track, and you have a tendency to spoil, and you have a tendency to ruin. But then this other aspect of the story says, but you're loved and you're accepted and you're forgiven, and there's no guilt in this, but you do have to realize that the God who has his hands on you is relentlessly committed to shape you in a particular way. So maybe Jeremiah's message echoes through the centuries to us with a very simple question. What is it that's messing up the clay today? What is it that you're trying to figure out by yourself? What is it you're trying to make sense of it? What is the cycle that you find yourself caught in? No matter what it is, I seem to end up back here again because the clay pot gets to a certain point and then the same error keeps cycling round and round again. And maybe then Jeremiah calls us to this different prayer, which says, God, help me to be more Christ-shaped. Because trying to figure this out by myself isn't working for me. Somewhere along the line, I need to remember that I'm the clay and God is the potter. Our video at the start of this series just hangs on this final thought that one of the things that makes Jeremiah so fascinating is that he's good. And one of the things that makes me so fascinating is how rare I manage to achieve that. How often do we live so poorly? How often is it that we live so badly? And Jeremiah comes to people like us through the centuries in a different time, in a different place, but with so often the same questions, and offers a simple but difficult alternative. Stop trying to do this by yourself and let the one who shaped you before you were born continue to shape you today. Why don't we stand together for a blessing? Just a simple thought to end this morning. As you reflect on what it is that's shaping you and what it is that should be shaping you, we simply say this: may God show you what you might become if you were brave enough to submit to his creative, merciful hand. And may his grace and peace be with you always. Amen.